Before I tell you how my own daughter-in-law locked me in a basement so her mother could take my bedroom, I need you to promise me one thing. Please don't skip ahead, because if you only hear the ending, you'll never understand how a family can slowly fall apart until it's almost too late. Have you ever trusted your own family so completely that you never imagined they could lock a door on you? I never thought it could happen to me either. One ordinary afternoon, my daughter-in-law smiled and asked if I could bring up a few old boxes from the basement. Without a second thought, I walked downstairs. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut. Then I heard the lock click. I pounded on that door, calling my son's name again and again, but no one answered. Sitting alone in the cold, dark basement, I had no idea that upstairs my daughter-in-law's mother was already carrying her suitcases into my bedroom, taking over the room I had called home for years. What happened to me wasn't just about a locked door or a stolen bedroom. It was about trust, betrayal, silence, and the heartbreaking moment I realized the people I loved most had stopped seeing me as family. They believed I was too old, too weak, and too afraid to fight back. They couldn't have been more wrong. Stay with me until the end, because every word of this story comes straight from the heart, and you may never look at family the same way again. My name is Norma Fenwick. I am 71 years old, and until recently I lived in what I thought was my son's house, in a bedroom that used to be mine, with a family that used to feel like mine too. I say used to because everything changed so fast that even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the sound of that basement door clicking shut and the silence that came rushing in after it, thick and cold. The kind of silence that has a weight to it. Let me back up a little so you understand how we even got here. Because none of this happened overnight. And I don't want you thinking I'm some fragile old woman who got blindsided out of nowhere. I saw the cracks forming long before the walls came down. My husband, Harold, passed away almost 6 years ago. Heart attack. Sudden, no warning at all. Just gone one Tuesday morning, while he was standing at the counter making coffee. The same way he'd made coffee every single morning for 4 to 3 years of marriage. One minute I was asking him if he wanted eggs, and the next minute he was on the kitchen floor and nothing I did brought him back. I don't tell you that for sympathy. I tell you that because I need you to understand what kind of woman walked into my son's house afterward. Not a helpless one. A woman who had already survived the worst thing life could hand her. And thought, foolishly maybe, that nothing after that could really break her again. After Harold died, I stayed in our house for about a year. I tried. I really did. I kept his side of the closet exactly as it was for longer than I probably should have. I kept making coffee for 2 people out of habit before catching myself and pouring half of it down the drain. The house got too quiet, too big, too full of a life that didn't exist anymore. My only child, kept telling me I shouldn't be alone in that house, rattling around all those empty rooms. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. So when he and his wife, Courtney, offered to have me move in with them, into the house they'd bought 2 years earlier, I cried right there at my old kitchen table. The same table Harold used to sit at every morning. I thought it was the kindest thing anyone had ever offered me in my whole life. I sold my house within 4 months. I put most of the proceeds into a savings account, kept a portion for myself for emergencies, and gave $40,000 toward helping Patrick and Courtney with a larger down payment on a bigger house. One with enough room for a growing family and, as I believed at the time, enough room for me too. I moved 3 states away to live with my son, his wife, and my 2 grandchildren. Grace, who was 7 then, and Oliver, who was 5. For the first year, things were good. I mean genuinely good. Not the kind of good you say to convince yourself later that it was all worth it. I had my own room, a nice one, on the second floor, with a window that looked out over the backyard where Oliver used to push his toy trucks through the dirt, and Grace used to do cartwheels on the grass until she got dizzy and fell over laughing. I helped with the kids after school, walking them from the bus stop, helping with homework, teaching Grace to bake the same sugar cookies Harold used to love. I cooked dinner some nights so Courtney and Patrick could rest after long days at work. I thought I had found a soft place to land for whatever years I had left. Courtney was polite to me back then, maybe not warm exactly. Not the kind of warmth you get from someone who chose you, but polite, the kind of politeness you extend to someone you're still getting used to having around. I told myself that was normal. New family dynamics take time, I thought. I was patient. I have always been a patient woman. Maybe too patient, and looking back now, I think that patience is exactly what let things go as far as they did. I remember one evening during that first, golden year especially clearly. A Sunday in early autumn, when Courtney asked me to teach her how to make Harold's favorite pot roast. The recipe I'd never written down anywhere. All of it living in my hands, and my memory from 40 years of practice. We stood together in that kitchen for nearly 3 hours. Flour dusted on both our aprons. Grace and Oliver underfoot chasing each other around the table. And Courtney said to me that evening, unprompted, "I'm really glad you're here. Norma, the kids are so lucky to have you so close." I believed her completely that night. I had no reason not to. That memory is one I've returned to often since. Not with bitterness exactly, but with a kind of sad wonder at how much can shift in a person's heart over the span of a couple of years. How a woman who meant those words sincerely in October could, by the following spring, be locking her own mother-in-law in a basement without so much as a second thought. Before I go further, I want you to understand what my life with Harold actually looked like. Because it matters for what comes later. We married young, both of us barely into our 20s. In a small church with folding chairs borrowed from the fellowship hall and a reception in my mother's backyard because neither family had much money to spend on a big wedding. Harold worked as a foreman at a manufacturing plant for 31 years. The same company, the same shift schedule. Coming home every evening at 5:15 like clockwork. So reliable you could set your watch by his truck pulling into the driveway. I stayed home with Patrick when he was small. Then went back to work part-time at the local elementary school as a teacher's aide once he was old enough for school himself. A job I kept for almost 20 years and loved every single day of. We weren't wealthy people, not by any measure. But we were careful with what we had. And we built something steady together, brick by brick. The way people used to build a life, before everyone got in such a hurry. Harold used to say the measure of a good life wasn't how much you accumulated, but how many people would show up for you without being asked, and by that measure, I always believed we'd done all right. Raising Patrick, I want to be honest, wasn't always easy either. He was a sensitive boy, quick to cry, quick to apologize even when he hadn't done anything wrong. The kind of child teachers described at conferences as eager to please in a tone that was half compliment and half quiet concern. I used to worry, watching him grow into a teenager who let friends walk all over him, that he'd need to learn how to hold his ground someday. How to say no to people who took advantage of his good nature. Harold used to tell me not to worry so much. That Patrick would grow into himself in his own time. The way most gentle boys eventually do. I believed him. I still believe Harold was right about most things in this life. Except maybe that one, because the truth is, Patrick never did fully learn how to hold his ground. Not until the basement forced the issue in a way nothing else ever had. The shift started small, the way these things always do. The way water finds the smallest crack in a foundation and slowly, quietly, widens it until one day the whole wall gives out. It wasn't one big fight or one cruel sentence that changed everything. It was little things stacking on top of each other, month after month, until I looked up one day and realized the whole house felt different toward me than it had a year before. Courtney started making comments about how much space I took up, even though I only ever used my one bedroom and helped out in shared spaces like the kitchen. She'd sigh loudly if I left a coffee cup in the sink for more than an hour. She'd correct the way I folded towels in front of the children. Not gently, but pointedly, like she was demonstrating to them who really ran this house and whose way of doing things actually counted. Once, I overheard her on the phone with a friend saying, "It's like having a permanent houseguest who never leaves," and laughing. And something in my chest went cold hearing that. Hearing myself described as a burden by someone I had tried so hard to be helpful to. Patrick, God love him. He's a good boy, always has been. Gentle since he was small. The kind of child who'd cry if he saw another kid get hurt on the playground even if he barely knew them. But he's never been the type to stand up in the middle of a room and say, "That's my mother, don't talk to her like that." He's more of a peacekeeper. The kind of man who thinks staying quiet keeps everyone happy. Who believes that if he just doesn't acknowledge a problem out loud, maybe it'll resolve itself, without anyone having to be uncomfortable. I understood that about him a long time ago. Going back to when he was a teenager and would rather let a friend take advantage of him than have an argument. But understanding it didn't make it hurt any less. Watching him stay silent, while his wife slowly chipped away at how his mother was treated in his own home. There were other small moments during that middle stretch I haven't mentioned yet. Moments I brushed off at the time, but that I now recognize as warning signs. I chose not to read clearly. Once, Courtney reorganized the entire kitchen while I was out at a doctor's appointment, moving every single item I used daily to different cabinets. Higher shelves I couldn't easily reach without pulling over the step stool. Without saying a word to me about it beforehand or asking if I minded. When I mentioned, gently, that I'd struggled to find the cinnamon that morning, she said, "Well, it makes more sense organized this way for how we actually cook." As though the fact that I cooked in that kitchen too, daily, for years, hadn't factored into her thinking at all. Another timer. She signed Grace and Oliver up for a weekend camping trip with her side of the family, Sharon included, and simply didn't mention it to me until the morning they were leaving. When I asked why everyone seemed to be packing bags. "Oh, I didn't think you'd want to come. Camping's not really your thing," she said. Which might have even been true. Except nobody had bothered to ask me. And I spent that whole weekend alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous and silent around me. Then Courtney's mother, Sharon Hastings, entered the picture more seriously. And that's really where the story I need to tell you begins in earnest. Sharon had always lived on her own, about 40 minutes away. Ever since her divorce from Courtney's father years back. A divorce I gathered had been messy and had left Sharon somewhat bitter and somewhat lonely, understandably so. She and Courtney were close. The kind of close where they talked on the phone every single day. Sometimes twice, sometimes for over an hour at a stretch. I didn't think much of it at first. A daughter loving her mother is a beautiful thing. And I never wanted to be the kind of mother-in-law who resents that closeness. I remembered how close I'd been with my own mother before she passed. And I thought, good. Courtney has that too. How lovely. But slowly, Sharon started coming around more. First it was Sunday dinners, which felt normal enough. Then it became staying over on weekends. using the guest room that used to sit mostly empty. Then, without anyone quite announcing it out loud, Sharon was there almost every single day, sitting in the living room like she paid rent on it, giving her opinions freely on how the kids should be raised, what they should be eating, how the house should be decorated, and eventually, how things around me specifically should change. She had a way of talking about me while I was standing right there, like I was a piece of furniture that happened to also have ears. Doesn't Norma have somewhere she could be volunteering? She'd say to Courtney, right in front of me, as if getting me out of the house for hours at a time was a considerate suggestion rather than a way of making room for herself. I remember the exact evening it started to turn from uncomfortable into something more serious, because it was Grace's 9th birthday, and we'd had a small party in the backyard with balloons tied to the fence posts and a homemade cake. I'd spent all afternoon decorating with her favorite purple frosting. After the guests left and the kids were finally down for the night, exhausted from cake and running around, I was in the kitchen washing the last of the dishes when I heard Courtney and Sharon talking in the dining room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I want to be clear about that. The kitchen and dining room in that house share a wall with a pass-through window, and voices carry whether you want them to or not, especially at night when the house has gone quiet around them. Sharon was saying something like, "That room upstairs, the one with the good light and the attached bathroom, that should really be mine if I'm going to keep helping you like this. I can't keep driving back and forth every single day at my age. Courtney, it's exhausting on these knees. And let's be honest, you need me here more than she does anything around this house." My stomach dropped when I realized which room they meant. That was my room. The one I had lived in for years by then. The one where I kept the quilt Harold's mother had made me as a wedding gift, hand-stitched over an entire winter. The one where I kept photo albums with pictures of Patrick as a baby, chubby-cheeked and grinning gap-toothed in his first grade school photo. The one with the little reading chair by the window where I read to Grace and Oliver almost every single night before bed, doing all the silly voices they loved. Grace curled up on one side of me and Oliver on the other. I didn't say anything that night. I told myself I misunderstood, that surely nobody would seriously suggest moving a 71-year-old woman out of the room she'd lived in 4 years just to make space for a mother-in-law who already had a perfectly good house of her own, 40 minutes away. I finished the dishes, dried my hands slowly, methodically, the way you do when you're trying to keep your hands busy so your mind doesn't spiral, and went to bed like nothing at all had happened, even though sleep didn't come easy that night. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying Sharon's words over and over. About 2 weeks later, on a grey Saturday morning with rain tapping lightly against the windows, Patrick came to find me in the kitchen where I was having my tea. He looked nervous, the way he used to look as a little boy when he'd broken something, and was trying to figure out how to tell me before I found out on my own, shifting his weight from foot to foot, unable to quite meet my eyes. He sat down across from me at the table and said, "Mom, I wanted to talk to you about something. And I want you to know upfront that this isn't permanent. It's just an idea. We're trying out for a little while." My heart was already sinking before he even finished the sentence. That familiar cold feeling spreading through my chest. He explained that Sharon had been such a big help with the kids, driving them to school some mornings, picking them up on days Courtney worked late, watching them during school breaks, and that it might make more sense for Sharon to have a more permanent, comfortable space in the house instead of driving back and forth every single day at her age. He said the room upstairs, my room, made the most logical sense because it was close to the kids' rooms and had its own bathroom attached, which, wowed, be easier for Sharon considering her knees weren't what they used to be after the divorce years and the weight she'd put on since. I sat there for a long moment just looking at my son, the boy I'd raised on my own some years when Harold travelled for work, the boy whose scraped knees I'd bandaged and whose homework I'd checked at this very kind of kitchen table for 18 years of his life. And where exactly am I supposed to go, Patrick? I asked, keeping my voice as calm and level as I could manage even though inside I felt like the floor was tilting sideways underneath me. He looked down at his hands, turning his coffee mug in a slow circle. We were thinking the basement, just temporarily. Mom, we'd fix it up nice for you. New carpet, maybe a space heater since it can get a little cool down there. Even a little television so you're comfortable. It's really not bad once it's set up properly. I want you to understand something about that basement. Because the word basement can mean a lot of different things, depending on the house. It wasn't a finished basement with big windows and a cozy little apartment feel like you see in some homes. The kind with a mini kitchen and nice lighting that some families turn into guest suites. It was a half-finished utility space with one small window near the ceiling that barely let in any light even at noon. Concrete floors that stayed cold no matter the season. Painted cinder block walls. And a single overhead bulb on a pulled chain that buzzed faintly when you turned it on. Patrick's tools lived down there in a metal cabinet, along with old boxes from when they'd first moved into the house years earlier. Boxes nobody had unpacked or looked at since. There was also a washer and dryer running against one wall that thumped and rattled loud enough to wake the dead during a spin cycle. That was the temporary upgrade being proposed for me, so said Sharon. A woman who had her own perfectly functional house, not even an hour away, could sleep in my room, in my bed's old spot, with the good afternoon light and the attached bathroom I'd grown so used to. I could have said no right then. I could have stood up from that kitchen table and refused outright. And looking back now, some part of me wonders if I should have. But I want to be honest with you about who I was in that moment. Not who I became later. I was scared. Scared of being difficult. Scared of becoming the mother-in-law nobody wanted around. The kind other women my age whispered about at church. The kind whose own families quietly resented having in the house. Scared that if I pushed back too hard, Patrick would start pulling away from me the way I'd watched happen to other women I knew. Women who fought too loud for what they deserved and ended up alone in facilities with nobody, visiting on Sundays because the family had decided they were too much trouble. So, instead of saying no, instead of standing my ground the way I probably should have, I said, all right. If it's temporary, and if it truly helps you all, and helps the kids, I'll do it. That was my first real mistake in all of this. Not the moving itself, exactly, but the way. I let myself believe words like temporary from people who had clearly already made up their minds and were simply waiting for me to agree so they wouldn't have to feel guilty about it. The move happened within a week, and Sharon didn't waste a single day getting settled. She showed up on a Tuesday afternoon with two of her friends from her book club and a rented moving truck. And by that evening, my room was gone. My bed frame, dismantled and carried out to the garage. My quilt, folded up hastily and shoved into a plastic storage bin without much care. For the careful stitching Harold's mother had put into every inch of it. My reading chair, pushed out into the hallway because it didn't match the new color scheme Sharon wanted to bring in. Mismatched fabric she said clashed with her new curtains. I stood in that hallway for the better part of an hour watching strangers I'd never met carry pieces of my life out of that room in cardboard boxes, labeled in Sharon's handwriting. Norma, basement, and nobody, not even Patrick, who was at work that day and came home to find it already mostly done. Thought to ask me how I felt watching it happen. The basement they gave me had a folding cot instead of a real bed for the first 4 nights. Until I finally asked, as gently as I could manage without sounding ungrateful, if we might get a proper mattress down there instead. Courtney acted surprised when I asked, genuinely surprised. Like the thought of my comfort at night simply hadn't occurred to her at all. Like a 71-year-old woman with arthritis in both hips sleeping on a canvas folding cot for days on end wasn't something that crossed her mind as a problem worth fixing sooner. They eventually brought down an old mattress from the garage, the one they used to keep on hand for the rare overnight guest before they'd bought a proper pull-out couch instead. It smelled faintly of dust and old mildew, no matter how many times I aired it out by the small window, and some mornings I'd wake up with my back aching so badly I could barely straighten up until I'd been moving around for an hour. I want to tell you about the isolation now, because that's the part that really broke something loose inside me. More than the cold room ever did. More than the uncomfortable mattress or the buzzing overhead light. Before the move, I ate dinner with the family every single night. 7 days a week. At that same table where Patrick had once done his homework as a boy. After the move, dinner started happening upstairs while I was, more often than not, simply not called down to join them. At first I told myself it was an honest oversight. That surely they just forgot in the chaos of everyday life. Busy with work schedules and school pickups and everything else families juggle. But it kept happening, night after night. I'd hear the clinking of plates and forks through the floor above me. The muffled sound of Grace laughing at something Oliver had said. His chair scraping against the floor as he wiggled the way 7-year-olds do at the table. And I'd sit down alone in that basement with a can of soup heated on a little hot plate they'd given me. Because apparently walking up the stairs to use the actual kitchen and eat with my own family had somehow become disruptive to whatever new routine Sharon had established up there since taking my room. Grace and Oliver still loved me. I want to make that abundantly clear. Because children see things adults try very hard to hide from each other. And they don't yet know how to pretend they haven't noticed. Grace would sneak downstairs, sometimes with a plate wrapped carefully in a paper towel, whispering as she came down the stairs, "Grandma, I saved you some. Don't tell Mom I came down here, okay?" As if we were co-conspirators in something forbidden. Which in a strange way, I suppose we were. Oliver, only 7 at the time, would sit on the bottom step some evenings and tell me all about his day at school. His voice echoing slightly off the concrete walls. Because he said the basement felt like a secret fort and he genuinely liked visiting me there. Unaware of the sadness underneath the game he'd made of it. Those small visits were the only warm moments in that whole cold season of my life. And I clung to them the way a woman holds onto a single candle during a long, dark storm, rationing the light so it might last just a little longer. There was another detail from those weeks I haven't told you yet. One that still stings more than I'd like to admit. My birthday fell right in the middle of that stretch. My 71st, and I want to be honest. I wasn't expecting anything grand. I've never been a woman who needs balloons and a big fuss made over her. But I did expect, foolishly maybe, that someone would remember the date at all. That morning, I came upstairs early, before the kids left for school, hoping maybe for a card on the counter. A phone call planned for later, something small. Nothing was said. Nobody mentioned it at breakfast. I sat down in the basement that evening, 71 years old, eating soup alone off a paper towel because I hadn't wanted to bother anyone by asking for a plate. And I let myself cry for the first time since Harold's funeral. Quietly, so nobody upstairs would hear me through the vents. Grace remembered 2 days later, bursting down the stairs with a drawing she'd made at school. Mortified when she realized the actual date had already passed. And she cried harder than I did when she understood nobody had told her. I held her and told her it was all right. That the drawing meant more to me than any cake could have. And that was true, but it didn't erase the ache of that quiet, forgotten evening alone with a bowl of soup going cold. The days down there settled into a rhythm after that, a lonely one. I'd wake early out of habit, the way I always had, and lie on that old mattress listening to footsteps overhead. The muffled sounds of a household starting its day without me in it. I'd wait until I heard the front door close, Patrick leaving for work, the kids' voices fading as they walked to the bus stop, before I'd finally come up to make my tea, timing my mornings around not being underfoot. Sharon would sometimes still be up there in her robe, and she had a way of looking through me rather than at me, answering questions with the fewest words possible, as though conversation itself were a resource she'd decided not to spend on me anymore. I kept myself busy however I could. I read a great deal. I did crossword puzzles Harold used to love. I called my friend Diane most afternoons, just to hear a friendly voice that still treated me like a whole person, instead of an inconvenience, to be managed and hidden away when company came. The day everything truly broke wide open. The day I'm sure you've been waiting to hear about. Came about 6 weeks after I'd been moved downstairs. Courtney and Patrick were hosting people from Patrick's work that evening. Some kind of dinner gathering for his boss and a few colleagues from the regional office. The sort of event where everything in the house has to look absolutely perfect. Matching napkins and the good china and candles lit just so. I found out about it that morning when Courtney came down to the basement, which she almost never did anymore, and told me, in a tone that still makes my chest tighten when I replay it, said I needed to stay down here tonight, just for a few hours, while the guests are over. I asked her why, genuinely confused at first, assuming maybe there simply wasn't enough seating for everyone at the table. Something practical and understandable like that. She looked at me, and I remember all kind of flat, business-like calm, as she said, without so much as a flicker of shame crossing her face, "It's just easier. Norma, Patrick's boss doesn't need to see the whole family situation. You understand. It's nothing personal. I just don't want to have to explain the basement thing to people who don't know us that well." The basement thing? That's what she called it, 2 words, tossed off like they weighed nothing at all. Like I was a leaky pipe or a cracked foundation that needed to be hidden away from company. Instead of a person, a grandmother, someone's mother, sitting 8 feet below an entire dinner party being thrown in the very house I had helped make possible with a down payment. A fact I hadn't brought up once since giving that money. And a detail I'll come back to shortly. I didn't argue with her that morning. I told her fine. And I spent the evening down there, listening to the muffled sound of laughter and clinking wine glasses drifting through the floor above me. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic drifting faintly through the old vents. My own stomach growling because nobody had thought to bring me a plate before the guests started, arriving around 6. Around 8 o'clock, I decided I needed to use the real bathroom upstairs. Not the cramped half bath they'd installed in the corner of the basement for me. The one barely large enough to turn around in without bumping an elbow on the wall. I climbed the narrow staircase quietly, careful not to make noise on the creaky 3rd step, and reached for the basement door handle at the top. It didn't open. I want you to sit with that feeling for just a second the way I had to sit with it that night, jiggling a locked handle in the near dark, standing at the top of a staircase in my own son's house, slowly understanding that the door had somehow been locked from the outside while dinner was underway. I knocked, softly at first, feeling embarrassed even in that moment. not wanting to disturb whatever pleasant conversation was happening on the other side of that door. Nobody came. I knocked harder, my knuckles starting to ache against the wood. Still nothing, just the muffled sound of laughter continuing on. Completely unbothered. Like nothing at all was happening on the other side of that thin door. I called out Patrick's name, then Courtney's. My voice climbing louder with each attempt. Panic starting to crawl up into my chest as I fully realized I was genuinely locked in. Unable to reach a proper bathroom. Unable to leave that basement. Standing in the semi-dark at the top of a staircase. In a cold room while a dinner party carried on just a few feet away from where I stood. Completely unheard. It was nearly 45 minutes. By my own count on the little clock down there. Before Grace, bless that child forever and always, noticed I hadn't come back up from wherever she assumed I'd gone and slipped quietly away from the dinner table to come check on me. I heard her small voice through the door asking if I was okay. And I told her, as calmly as I could manage with my heart still pounding, that the door seemed to be locked somehow and I needed help getting out. She ran, I found out later, straight to her father, tugging on his sleeve in front of his boss and everyone. When Patrick finally opened that door, I remember the look on his face clearly. Somewhere between confusion and dawning guilt. Like a man waking abruptly from a dream. He didn't want to admit he'd been having all along. Courtney appeared behind him a moment later, wine glass still in hand, and when I asked her, my voice shaking despite every effort to keep it steady, why the basement door had been locked while I was down there, she had the nerve to say, breezily, like it cost her absolutely nothing, "Oh, that lock sticks sometimes. I didn't even realize you were down there. I just figured you'd already gone to bed early." I looked at her, at that easy lie sliding off her tongue without so much as a pause. And something inside me went, very quiet and very still. Not the quiet of sadness. Something else entirely. Something that had been building slowly under the surface for 6 long weeks. Finally settled into place inside me. Hard and clear, and I knew, standing there in that hallway at nearly 9 o'clock at night in my robe, that I was completely done being patient. I didn't cause a scene at the dinner party. And I want you to know that about me. Because believe me, I absolutely could have. I could have walked straight into that dining room in my robe and told Patrick's boss exactly what kind of living situation his employee's own mother had been reduced to in that house. But that's not who I am, and more importantly, it wouldn't have solved a single thing except embarrass Patrick in front of people whose opinion mattered a great deal to his career. And I have never once wanted to hurt my son, only to be seen by him. So I went back downstairs quietly, and I sat on the edge of that old mattress in the dim light. And for the first time since Harold died, I let myself really think, clearly and without emotion clouding the picture, about exactly what I was going to do next. Here's something I hadn't told anyone in that house up to that point. Something I'd kept quiet out of a mix of humility and, frankly, not wanting to seem like the kind of mother who holds money over her son's head. When Patrick and Courtney bought that house 6 years earlier, right around the time Harold passed away, I had given them $40,000 toward the down payment. Wanting them to have a real home to raise their family in. Wanting to be useful in my grief, instead of just sitting alone with it. It wasn't a loan on paper, not officially. Because Patrick is my only child and I trusted him completely. And at the time it felt cold and unnecessarily formal to draw up legal paperwork between a mother and her own son. But I had a bank statement showing the transfer clear as day. And I had, tucked away in a folder inside my old fireproof lockbox which I still kept with me even down in that basement, an email Patrick had sent me back then, thanking me sincerely for helping make the house possible for us and promising, in his own written words, that no matter what happens down the road, Mom, You'll always have a place here with us. I promise you that. I hadn't thought about that email in years, honestly. I found it again that night, scrolling back through old messages on my laptop, looking for I don't quite know what at first. Maybe just some kind of proof to myself that I hadn't imagined the loving family I once believed I had. And there it was, in his own words, typed by his own hand. A promise made when he needed my money badly and had apparently forgotten the very moment my presence stopped being convenient for him and his wife. I sat on that mattress until nearly 1 a.m, long after the last guest's car had pulled out of the driveway and the house above me had finally gone silent. I thought about calling Diane right then, at that hour, just to hear a familiar voice. But I didn't want to wake her over something that could wait until sunrise. Instead, I got up, turned on the small lamp on the folding table beside my bed, and pulled out the fireproof lockbox from under the cot where I kept it. I hadn't opened it in probably a year. Inside were the things I'd carried with me through every move of my adult life. Harold's watch, our marriage certificate, Patrick's baptism record, and a slim folder of financial papers I'd kept out of old habit more than necessity. I sat there in that dim basement light, going through each item slowly. And somewhere in the middle of that folder, I found the printed bank statement from 6 years earlier showing the wire transfer, and clipped behind it, the printed email from Patrick I'd saved and tucked away without ever expecting to need it again. Reading his words again that night, in his own voice, in writing he couldn't later deny or reframe, steadied something in me. It wasn't proof I needed for a courtroom. It was proof I needed for myself. A reminder that I hadn't imagined the family who once existed in that house. That somewhere under all of this, the son who wrote those words was still in there somewhere. And that I owed it to both of us to give him one real chance to remember who he'd promised to be before I let this go any further than it already had. Because a mother's love, even when it's been wounded badly, still looks for the smallest reason to hope before it reaches for anything harder. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what I did next. Because I know how this can sound if I don't explain myself carefully. This was never really about the money, not at its heart. I never once seriously considered suing my own son or trying to take that house away from him and his family through some legal maneuver. That's not the kind of woman I am. And it's not the kind of grandmother I wanted Grace and Oliver to grow up remembering. One who fought her own son in court. But I realized that night, sitting alone on that old mattress, that I had been quietly allowing myself to be treated like an inconvenient guest who had overstayed her welcome in a home I had personally helped build with my own savings, by people who had conveniently forgotten every single kindness I'd ever shown them over 6 long years. And I decided, right then, that I wasn't going to let that continue in silence any longer. Not for one more day. The next morning, I called my old friend Diane, someone I'd known since our children were small and in grade school together, and whose son happens to be a family law attorney with his own small practice about 20 minutes from the house. I asked her for his number, feeling a little strange even asking, and I called him that same afternoon, while everyone else was out of the house. I explained the whole situation to him, the down payment, the old email, the basement, the locked door, all of it laid bare. He listened patiently, taking notes I could hear him scribbling on the other end of the line, and told me that while I likely didn't have strong grounds to force any kind of formal ownership claim on the house itself since there was no official loan agreement signed at the time, I absolutely had solid grounds to formally request repayment of that $40,000 as a personal loan between family members. especially with written evidence like that email, showing Patrick's own clear acknowledgement of my contribution and his explicit promise regarding my place in that home going forward. He said we could send a formal letter, not necessarily to sue right away. Nothing that dramatic to start, but to open a serious, documented conversation and put things properly in writing, since apparently spoken words in that house didn't seem to carry much weight or meaning anymore. I remember asking him, almost embarrassed by the question, whether what I was considering made me a terrible mother, whether pursuing this at all made me the kind of woman who used money as a weapon against her own child. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then he said something I've held onto ever since. He said, "Mrs. Fenwick, in my experience, the parents who actually love their children are the ones willing to have the hard conversation, instead of just swallowing it and letting resentment rot everything from the inside for the next 20 years. You're not punishing your son. You're giving him a chance to fix something before it becomes unfixable." I thanked him and hung up the phone, and I sat there in the basement for a long while just turning his words over, testing them for truth, and deciding, finally, that he was right. He drafted the letter within a few days and sent it to my email so I could review it before anything went further. It was calm, professional, nothing threatening in its language. Simply a clear statement of the facts, the amount given, the date of the transfer, the email Patrick had sent acknowledging it, and a request that we sit down as a family to discuss both repayment terms and, more importantly to me, my living conditions going forward. I didn't send it right away. I wanted to give Patrick one more chance to come to the right conclusion on his own, without a lawyer's letterhead forcing his hand, because some part of me still hoped my son might find his own way back to decency without needing to be pushed there by paperwork. I sat with that advice for 2 full days before deciding how to move forward, turning it over in my mind at night down in that basement. During those 2 days, I kept mostly to myself, polite but noticeably distant, watching the way Courtney and Sharon moved through that house like nothing at all was wrong, like locking a grieving woman in a basement during a dinner party was simply an unfortunate scheduling hiccup not worth dwelling on. Sharon, in particular, had made herself thoroughly at home in my old room by then. I'd walk past that hallway sometimes on my way to the kitchen and see the door standing open. My old window fitted with new floral curtains Sharon had picked out herself. The whole room rearranged so completely that it no longer looked like anywhere I had ever lived at all. Like my 4 years there had simply been painted over. On the 3rd day, a Tuesday, I asked Patrick if we could talk, just the 2 of us, without Courtney anywhere nearby. He looked wary when I asked, his shoulders sensing slightly, but he agreed. And we sat outside together on the back porch where I used to watch Grace do her cartwheels on warmer afternoons. I told him calmly, without raising my voice even once, that I needed to discuss something serious with him. Something that had been sitting heavy on my chest. I told him about the letter from the attorney, about the $40,000, about the email he himself had sent me years before. I watched his face go visibly pale as I spoke, the color draining from it the way it used to when he was a boy, caught in a lie he thought he'd gotten away with. "Mom, you're not actually going to sue me," he said, real fear creeping into his voice, which honestly surprised me a little when I heard it, because if he was that afraid of a lawsuit over money, some part of him clearly already knew, deep down, that he'd have a very hard time defending what had been quietly happening to me in that house for weeks. "I don't want to sue you, Patrick," I told him, and I meant every word of it. "But I need you to understand something clearly. I gave you and Courtney a piece of my life, Savings because I trusted you completely. Because you're my only son. And because you promised me, in your own handwriting, that I would always have a place in that house. And instead, I got locked in a basement so your wife's mother could sleep comfortably in my old bed while your boss ate dinner upstairs. I am not asking for that money back because I need it to survive. I still have savings of my own. I am asking for it because I need you to truly understand how seriously wrong this has all gone. And I need something real to change. Or I am going to have to start making some very different decisions about where I spend the years I have left in this life. He didn't say much of anything that day, sitting there staring out silently at the backyard. And I could see him turning things over slowly in his mind. Maybe for the very first time really seeing what had happened over those past couple of months instead of just going along with it, quietly to keep the peace at home, like he always did. I left him there alone on the porch and went back down to my basement. And that night, for the first time in weeks, I heard raised voices coming from upstairs after the children had finally gone to bed. I couldn't make out every single word through the floor, but I heard my own name mentioned more than once. And I heard Courtney's voice getting sharp and defensive, climbing in pitch, and at one point I distinctly heard Patrick say, loud enough to carry clearly down through the old floor vents, "She helped us buy this house, Courtney, and we put her in the basement. Do you have any idea how that actually looks?" I won't pretend that one argument fixed everything overnight, because it absolutely didn't. And I don't want to give you some tidy, unrealistic version of events. Change like that doesn't happen in a single conversation, no matter how honest it finally becomes. But something did shift after that night, something real. 2 days later, Patrick came down to the basement on his own, sat on the edge of that old mattress next to me without being asked, and told me he'd spoken seriously with Courtney and with Sharon both, and that they'd finally agreed. Sharon needed to find her own arrangement going forward, whether that meant simply staying at her own house full-time and driving over whenever she was truly needed, or finding some other solution entirely. But that the room upstairs, my room, would be given back to me properly. I'd love to tell you Sharon left gracefully, with warmth and understanding, but that wouldn't be honest. And I promised myself from the start that I'd tell you this story exactly, the way it actually happened, not the way that makes everyone look good. Sharon was absolutely furious when she found out. She accused me, right to my face, standing in what was still, for one more week, technically my old bedroom, of manipulating my own son, of using guilt and old money to control the entire family, of never really wanting her to be close with her own daughter and grandchildren in the first place. She said all of this with her hands planted firmly on her hips, like I was somehow the intruder in this story instead of her. I let her finish every word without interrupting. I didn't raise my voice back at her, not once. I simply sighed. Once she'd run out of breath, "Sharon, I understand you love your daughter and your grandchildren very much, and I don't fault you one bit for wanting to be close to them. But I am this family's grandmother too, and I will not spend whatever years I have left sleeping in a cold basement so that you can be more comfortable in a house that was never yours to begin with." Before she left that day, Sharon said one more thing that I've turned over in my mind many times since. She stopped in the doorway, her arms full of folded curtains she was taking down, and she said, quieter than before, almost like she didn't mean for me to hear it clearly, "I just wanted to be close to my grandkids too, Norma. Is that so wrong? And just all moment." I felt something soften in my chest, because I understood that feeling better than she probably realized. I told her, honestly, it's not wrong at all, Sharon. But there's a difference between wanting closeness and taking someone else's place to get it. You could have asked me how to share this family instead of trying to replace me in it. She didn't have an answer for that. And she finished packing in silence, and I let her. Because some conversations don't need a final word from either side to be finished. They just need to be said honestly once, and left to settle in their own time. She moved out within the month. Back to her own home 40 minutes away. Though I want to be fair here, she still visits regularly now. And over time, sharpest aids between the two of us have softened considerably. Mostly for the sake of Grace and Oliver, who deserve to grandmothers, capable of at least being civil with one another at birthday parties and holidays without the whole room feeling tense. Courtney and I had a much harder road back to each other, if I'm honest with you. There was a period of about 3 weeks where we barely spoke at all beyond what was strictly necessary. Both of us too proud and too hurt to make the first real move toward the other. But then something happened that I still think about often, even now. Oliver got sick, a bad flu that had him running a high fever for 2 straight days. And Courtney was completely exhausted from a demanding week at work and worry over her son. And I simply stepped in the way I always had before any of this. Before the basement, before Sharon. Before any of it had ever happened. I sat with Oliver through the worst of the night. Cool damp clothes on his forehead. Humming the same old songs. I used to hum to Patrick himself, when he was small and sick with fevers of his own. In the early morning, Courtney came in to check on her son and found me asleep in the chair beside his bed. My hand still resting near his. And something about seeing that image, I think, quietly cracked open something in her that all my calm, measured words hadn't managed to reach in 3 long weeks. She came to me later that same week, alone, without Sharon or Patrick anywhere nearby, and she apologized. Not a perfect apology, I'll admit. Not one that fully explained away everything that had happened to me over those months. But a real one nonetheless, with genuine tears in it, where she admitted plainly that she'd let her own mother's opinions and her own private insecurities about being enough, as both a wife and a daughter, push her into treating me in a way she knew, somewhere deep down the whole time, was cruel and unnecessary. She told me she was deeply ashamed of the basement, ashamed of that locked door, ashamed of hiding me away from Patrick's co-workers like I was something embarrassing, instead of someone she should have been proud to introduce. I won't lie to you and pretend it took me no time at all to find words back to her. Because 6 long weeks of cold basement nights and quiet, lonely dinners eaten alone don't just evaporate. Because of one heartfelt apology, delivered in a kitchen. But I looked at her standing there, and I thought about Grace sneaking downstairs with plates of food wrapped in paper towels, and Oliver calling that basement his own secret fort, and Patrick finally standing up for me out on that back porch. And I thought about Harold, who always used to tell me that holding onto anger for too long is a lot like drinking poison yourself and waiting patiently for the other person to get sick from it. We talked for a long time that afternoon in the kitchen, longer than we'd talked in months, like finally exhaling after holding my breath for weeks on end. My quilt is back on the bed where it belongs. My reading chair is back by the window, catching that same good afternoon light. Grace still climbs into that chair some nights when I read to her and Oliver before bed. Though Oliver insists now, at 9 years old, that he's getting a little too old for bedtime stories. Even though he still somehow ends up sitting cross-legged on the floor listening closely, every single timer, pretending he's only there to keep his sister company. These days, Grace has taken to calling family dinner the whole crew as a joke, counting heads around the table each night like she's still half worried someone might quietly disappear from it again. Oliver, for his part, still occasionally asks if we can eat down in the basement just for fun, Like old times, not understanding, in the sweet oblivious way of children, what those months actually cost me. Entirely. Laugh and tell him grandmas. Knees have decided they like the stairs a little less than they used to. And we leave it at that. Because some things a 9-year-old doesn't need carrying around in his heart the way I carried it in mine. Patrick started a new habit after everything settled. One I never asked for but deeply appreciate. Of stopping by my room most evenings just to check in. Sitting on the edge of the bed for 10 or 15 minutes. To talk about nothing in particular. The way he used to do as a boy before school. And I think that habit is his own quiet way of making sure I know, every single day, that I am seen and that I am wanted in that house. Patrick and I have a closer relationship now than we did even before any of this happened. Strange as that might sound to you. I think almost losing the trust between us made him truly realize how much he'd been quietly taking for granted, and how easily plain comfort can curdle into real cruelty if nobody stops to notice it happening right under their own roof. He never did formally pay back that $40,000. And honestly, in the end, I never really needed him to. What I wanted all along was for him to truly see me again. To remember that I am not a piece of furniture to be rearranged or conveniently hidden away in a basement whenever it suits everyone else. And I believe, now, watching him with his children and with me, that he finally does see me, clearly. The way a son should see his mother. I think about that basement sometimes. Late at night when the whole house is quiet and everyone else is asleep. Upstairs where they belong. And where I finally belong to again now. I think about how easy it would have been to simply accept it all without a fight. To shrink myself down, smaller and smaller with each passing week until there was nothing left of me at all but a quiet old woman in a cold room who never once made anyone uncomfortable with her needs. I am so glad, looking back now, that I didn't let that happen to me. I am glad I found my voice again, even at 71 years old. Even after everything Harold and I built together, over for decades, and everything I thought I understood about what family was supposed to mean. I learned, the hard way, that love without real respect isn't actually love at all. It's just quiet tolerance dressed up in nicer words. And I have decided I refuse to spend whatever years I have left simply being tolerated instead of being truly fully loved by the people I gave everything to. I think, too, about all the other women out there who might be sitting in a version of that basement right now. Maybe not a literal one with cold concrete floors and a buzzing overhead bulb, but a figurative one all the same. Quietly shrinking themselves down to make room for someone else's comfort. Telling themselves it's temporary. Telling themselves it's easier not to make a fuss. If that's you tonight, I want you to hear this clearly from someone who's lived it. Speaking up for yourself isn't selfish, even when the people around you try to make you feel that way. Asking to be treated with basic dignity in your own family isn't manipulation. No matter what anyone tells you to your face, you are allowed to take up space in the life you helped build. You are allowed to ask for a seat at the table, a warm bed, an honest answer. And you should never have to earn back things that were rightfully yours in the first place. I don't share any of this to make Patrick or Courtney out to be monsters. Because they aren't. Not really. They're ordinary people who let fear and convenience and someone else's manipulation pull them into treating a person they loved unkindly for a while. And then, thankfully, they found their way back before too much damage became permanent. I share this because I believe most families have a version of this story somewhere in them. Some quiet unfairness nobody wants to name out loud. And sometimes it takes one person finally refusing to stay small and silent to turn the whole thing around before it's too late to fix. If you are watching this right now and you still have a grandmother in your life, call her today, not tomorrow, today. Ask her how she's really doing. Not the polished answer she gives everyone else who asks out of politeness, but the real one underneath it. Make sure she has a warm place to sleep at night and an actual seat at your table every single evening. Not just when it happens to be convenient. Not just when there's nobody important around to see her sitting there. Grandmothers give and give and give to everyone around them until sometimes, without meaning to, the people they love the most forget that they're allowed to need something back in return. We don't always say it out loud when we're hurting, because so many of us were raised to believe that being useful and being quiet was the price of belonging somewhere. And it takes a very long time, sometimes a whole lifetime, to unlearn a lesson like that. Some nights, even now, I still find myself waking at odd hours out of old habit, half expecting to hear a lock click somewhere nearby. And it takes a moment lying there in the dark before I remember I'm upstairs, in my own room, in my own bed, with the window that lets in the morning light exactly the way it always used to. I don't think that habit will fully leave me, not complete not at my age. But I've stopped letting it frighten me the way it once did. Instead, I lie there for a minute, listen to the quiet, ordinary sounds of a house full of people who love me. And I go back to sleep grateful, truly grateful, for the second chance this family somehow found its way back to giving each other. Now I want to hear from you, all of you watching this tonight. Tell me where you're watching this from. Put your city down there in the comments below. I read every single one of them myself. And it genuinely means more to me than you probably realize to see how far these stories of mine seem to travel out into the world. And if you love your grandma, whether she's still here with you today or whether she's watching over you now from somewhere far away, go ahead and hit that like button for her. Subscribe if you haven't already done so. And share this with someone in your life who really needs to hear it tonight. Take care of each other out there. Hold your people a little closer tonight than you did yesterday. And remember that it is never too late, at any age, to ask for the respect you have earned simply by loving someone. For as long and as faithfully as I have loved my family, I'll see you in the next one.